Everyone. First seminar of the semester. We're really fortunate that Milan Svolik is a professor of political science at Yale. He wrote a really important book on authoritarianism. And in recent years, he's been doing very innovative seminal work on democratic attitudes, how we measure democratic attitudes, how we assess whether voters, when and whether they're willing to trade off democracy for either for partisanship or for substantive outcomes. So he's really been doing the most important work of anyone in political science on this topic for quite a while. We're thrilled to have you here, Milan.
Thank you. Thanks for having me. Thank you all for coming. Thanks for the generous introduction. And what I would like to present today is a joint work with Austin Jang, who's a grad student at Yale. And roughly, the talk is about two papers. I'm going to focus on one that we are writing up right now. And so please, if you have any comments, if I'm not being clear, interrupt me and ask. So the rough topic is who really supports for democracy and how can we measure it? And so maybe as a motivation, imagine an election is coming up and think of a politician or a party that you would like to vote for. And then suppose that politician or that party says, when we get to power, we'll make sure that those journalists that were criticizing us, they feel it, that they know what they were doing. Or they say, and also we'll implement a judicial reform such that those judges who were ruling against us when we were out of power can no longer do that. Would you still vote for that party or that politician? That, I think, is a key question we have to ask if we want to understand democratic backsliding. And the reason is that one prominent feature of this process is that this is the undermining of democracy by politicians that were democratically elected. And the fact that they are democratically elected implies that the voter has also a say over whether to keep them in power. In other words, elections represent a fundamental tool of democratic self-defense. Voters have the power to unelect politicians who undermine democracy. But crucially, that might be costly. It might be costly because, after all, I asked you about a politician that you like, that you would otherwise vote for. In other words, they will only do so if they're willing to prioritize democratic principles over partisan interests. And in this paper, and the two papers that in a second I will hint at, what we are trying to understand is how can we find out who this individual is? How would we measure the kind of individual who, when faced with the trade-off, with the choice between partisan interests and democratic principles, she will go for democratic principles? And so one way that political scientists have been doing this is asking questions like this one. How important is it for you to live in a country that is governed democratically? Please answer on a scale where 1 means not at all important and 10 means absolutely important. How important is it for you to live in a country that's governed democratically? 10, okay. Well, then, all right. So you see the problem, right? So, for instance, this is 7 European countries, and most of the data that I will present today will be based on these countries. But our hope is that we'll ultimately have 20. We have the data, we just haven't done the analysis. And this is the distribution of the answers to that question in these 7 countries. One prominent feature of this is that if you were not to see the labels that label the individual countries, Estonia, Germany, Poland, Serbia, Spain, Sweden, Ukraine, you might not know which ones are which, right? This is a mix of countries, some of which are perfectly democratic, like Sweden, some of which at the time of this survey, 2021, were criticized for being backsliding democracies. So think about Poland, and some that people wouldn't even call democratic around that time, Serbia, for instance, right? And yet that distribution is roughly similar. The modal choice is 10 out of 10, just like over here, right? And the mean varies very little. The lowest scoring country is Estonia with 8.3. And the highest scoring country is Sweden with 8.9. In fact, the median is 9 everywhere. So about half of the population answers at 9 and above, except in Sweden, because in Sweden things are always better than anywhere else. There it is 10 out of 10. In other words, if we were to use this measure to try to differentiate between publics that tolerate leaders who undermine democracy, like in Serbia or Poland, and those where they do not, say Sweden and Estonia, we wouldn't know it. It would be really hard to figure out the difference. So this is the same question, but now asked in Turkey. This is around also the same time, 2020, 2021. And these are the scores of the supporters of the major parties in Turkey. So the governing AKP and MHP coalition, the opposition CHP and the İYİ party, and then parties that are sometimes aligned with the opposition. So the Kurdish HDP and the Saadet party, which is a moderate Islamist party in Turkey. And here is a different version of the same challenge. If you were using this question to figure out, oh, are you the kind of voter who has been willing to support Erdogan and his undermining of democracy in Turkey? Or are you the kind of voter who cares about democracy enough so that you are opposed to it? It would really be hard to tell. The average score for the AKP voter is 8.52. The average score for the CHP, the main opposition party voter, well, is slightly higher, 8.8. But here we're already in a region where the differences that we are trying to see are past the decimal point, not ahead of the decimal point, right? So if anything, it seems like these are scales that somehow require a very fine-tuned approach to figure out who is for democracy and who against. And by the way, those who are most concerned about or supportive of democracy here are the moderate Islamists from the Saadet party group. So what we are doing here is we would like to judge our existing measures of support for democracy differently. So rather than asking people how much do you care about democracy, so rather than asking about attitudes, we will phase respondents with candidate choices, and we will ask them to pick between the two candidates. If you have seen these, and people have done a lot of these are sometimes referred to as conjoint experiments. We vary a lot of things about these candidates. So each respondent will see a series of pairs of candidates. They will have partisanship. So here this is from Germany. So it's the Greens versus the AfD. They will have policies. So they will say things about economic policies. So for instance, income taxes, carbon taxes, social policies, immigration, same-sex marriage, minority languages. And in some countries also their foreign relations. How much should be governed by the EU as opposed to the country itself, attitudes, policies towards Russia. But crucially, one of the candidates at random will also be assigned a position that violates a democratic principle. So here, that middle row is describing democracy positions. The undemocratic position is adopted by the AfD candidate, who is saying that that candidate is described as having supported a ban on foreign funding for domestic and non-governmental organizations critical of his party's policies. Whereas this other candidate from the Greens is saying something empty. She's saying participate in a working group that reviewed the structure of parliamentary committees. So this is on purpose something that's completely democratically neutral, an empty statement. Whereas here we want to see what this voter who sees this choice, if they actually do support the AfD, are they going to vote for the AfD in spite of the fact that that candidate has supported something undemocratic? And so what we would like to do is to evaluate measures of support for democracy by this standard. That is, are you willing to, in scenarios like these, abandon a candidate that you would normally vote for if that candidate does something undemocratic? And so what is that undemocratic thing? So we had a number of positions. Some were on electoral fairness. We tried to cover the three main dimensions of democracy: electoral competitiveness, checks and balances, and civil liberties. So for instance, here, encouraged his supporters to violently disrupt campaign rallies of his political opponents is one example of an undemocratic position that violates electoral fairness. On checks and balances, for instance, we had said the government should discipline judges who publicly criticize it, right? So undermining judicial checks and balances. And we have most positions on civil liberties. And the primary reason for this was that in Europe, this is the domain of democratic liberties that is most explored by politicians who undermine democracy. So for instance, the first one said the government should prosecute journalists who accuse the government of corruption. And so the data that I will present is based on these 7 European countries, and I will also show you something from the United States. But overall, we would like to integrate it with a bunch of other countries, including a lot of Latin American countries, but also Tunisia, Turkey, Singapore, Northern Ireland, where we have done a similar research design. So overall, this means that what you will see today has roughly 10,000 respondents and more than 200,000 choices between experimental candidates like these. But overall, that's all the way to 1 million choices. So we have a lot of data, and we would like to see what can we learn from this data about who really cares about democracy.
How many choices would each respondent make?
It depends on the study,
Okay.
but it was always somewhere between, it was always somewhere between roughly 6 to 8. The smallest number was in some Turkey surveys because those had to be done in person, all the way to up to 20 choices, for instance, in these European countries. And sorry?
Who's being surveyed?
So this is a representative sample in each country. Right? And so one advantage of having some respondents who have been asked a lot of choices like this is that we're able to estimate quantities not only at the average population level, but also the level of the individual. And I will show you a study from the United States that attempts to do that. So here are the questions that we would like to look at. And so, as I said, one way that we as political scientists try to measure people's support for democracy is to ask questions like these. So how important is it for you to live in a country that's governed democratically? How satisfied are you with democracy? So this is sometimes interpreted as a measure of support for democracy or an indicator of support for democracy. To what extent do you agree with the statement, democracy may have problems, but it is a better form of government? And then there's a battery that's frequently used that says, what do you think about the following political systems? For instance, having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliament or elections. Having experts, not government, make decisions for our country. Having the army rule, having a democratic political systems. These, by our count, are the most frequently used items. And actually, the one that's the most frequently used is the satisfied question. That one is almost always in every cross-national survey, but also in surveys that do not bother to ask these other questions. So for instance, the NES or the British election study will ask this question, but often not the other questions. And what we would like to know is, does answering 10 out of 10 on how important tell us anything about how an individual is going to act in a scenario like this? Does it predict at all whether when faced with the choice between partisanship and democracy, you will actually side with democracy? So what's the difference? There's a number of differences, but there's one that we would like to emphasize. So first of all, when we ask questions like, democracy may be not perfect, but it's the best political system we have. Here, democracy is presented as a very abstract concept. Whereas you saw that in the candidate choice scenario, these candidates are proposing or being described as having done very specific things about democratic living. And I think that's an advantage because that speaks to the concrete actions that politicians often take in real life. It might be easy to agree in the abstract with democracy, but much harder to oppose a particular undemocratic action. There are also specific candidates and parties presented in these scenarios, as opposed to usually the context of these questions is that partisanship is not even an issue. It's a very, again, general question. The outcome of these questions, and we will refer to them as attitudinal questions, is an attitude. How important is it for you to live in a country that's governed democratically? One problem with that is that when somebody says 8 out of 10, what exactly does that mean, right? Whereas here, I'm going to ask you to vote to choose between 2 candidates. And so I have a metric of a dependent variable that's very easily relatable to the real world. This is the number of individuals who are willing to put partisanship or democracy above partisanship. It's It's a fraction of individuals. One key aspect also of this technique is that it's counterfactual. So we'll be inferring an individual's willingness to vote for side with democracy as opposed to partisanship. Whereas with questions with these attitudinal questions, we have direct measurement. But the one aspect, the one difference between these two approaches is here, I think, when it comes to how we ask about support for democracy. The attitudinal question asks about democracy alone. And again, if it's democracy in isolation, it might be easy to agree that democracy is better than dictatorship. Whereas in our setting, we are explicitly saying, we'll ask you to trade off democracy, or we ask whether you are willing to trade off democracy against competing considerations. And it's the absence of competing considerations from these attitudinal questions that we would like to argue is the biggest design flaw. That we might care about democracy, but the challenge is, do you care about it enough to actually prioritize it over partisan interests? And by construction, attitudinal questions simply do not allow us to ask that. So a little bit of theory. So we would like to argue that when people are presented, we call these candidate choice scenarios, that what we get is a revealed preference measure of support for democracy. What we mean by that is that we're not interested whether you will vote for candidate 1 and candidate 2, but rather we are interested in knowing what voting for candidate 1 and candidate 2 with particular attributes reveals how much you care about democracy as opposed to other things. And so, since we're claiming that it's going to reveal something, we need to be very clear about, well, what exactly is it revealing, right? And so let me outline a brief theory of what we mean by that. So suppose that a voter cares about two things, and here the two things are, they have spatial preferences over policies. And so this XI is voter I's preference over issue area K, so think taxes, immigration, abortion, and so on. And XJK is where a candidate in this candidate choice scenario and in real life stands on it. We're taking a difference and squaring it because we are saying that ideally each voter would like a candidate who's exactly where they are so that that difference is 0. So there's a minus in front of that. And alpha over there is a weight that that voter attaches to that particular issue area. So that's the classic spatial view of politics where voters prefer politicians who are as close as possible to them on multiple policy issues. Our primary interest is in the second part, which says, and the voter dislikes candidates who are undemocratic. So here the D- is an indicator, whether in the real life or in that candidate choice experiment, that politician is endorsing something undemocratic. 1 means undemocratic, 0 means complying with democratic principles. And delta here is a parameter that reflects how much do you care about that as a voter. And then minus in front of it means that you dislike politicians who undermine democracy. Whether that's actually the case is something we would like to infer from the data. Is that delta actually a positive number? Do people actually care about democracy in the first place? So now that we have these preferences, what does voting for candidate 1 as opposed to candidate 2 actually reveal? So suppose that you have two candidates. And just to keep it very simple, suppose it's on a single issue, so K equals 1. And suppose both candidates are perfectly democratic. What I mean by that those D- indicators, both for candidate 1 and candidate 2, are 0, so two candidates are perfectly democratic. And suppose that candidate 1, so X1 is greater than X2, means that candidate 1 adopts a position that's to the right of candidate 2. Right? And suppose you vote for candidate 1. So what does that reveal? So literally, we compare these two pair of functions with just one policy issue. This term is 0, and we solve for the inequality. So what does it mean that you voted for candidate 1? What does it reveal? Well, it reveals that you as a voter are to the right of this quantity. What is that quantity? Well, it's X1 plus X2. Remember, X1 and X2 are the positions of the two candidates. Divided by 2 means that's the midpoint between the two candidates. So if the two candidates are perfectly democratic and you vote for candidate 1, it means that you are to the right of the midpoint. That is, you are rightist voter, right? You like candidate 2 normally, right? So that's the first point. Now, what does it mean that you are willing to defect from candidate 1 to candidate 2 when candidate 1 becomes undemocratic? We solve the same inequality, and what it reveals is that delta over alpha, so here, delta is how much you care about democracy, alpha is how much you care about policy, is greater than something. And now what's this something? So the first part here is how far from each other are the two candidates? So in other words, if I face you with these scenarios, not everybody is faced with the same democracy stress test, the same hurdle, but it depends on how far the two candidates are from each other. The further they are, the harder the trade-off between democracy and policy that I'm asking you to make. The second quantity here says, it also depends how far you as a voter are from the midpoint between the two candidates. If this quantity is large, it means that you as a voter are very far from that midpoint. You're an extremist. So to put it into words, what it means is that in these scenarios, it will be very important, first of all, how far the two candidates are. The further they are apart, think Clinton versus Trump, right? That's very far, and that's a tough trade-off. We're asking to make one of the voters who supports, let's say, Clinton here in this scenario. But it also means whether you as a voter are an extremist. And so if we want to face respondents with the democracy stress test of a comparable difficulty, what we need to make sure is that this right-hand side is roughly similar, so that we are not facing some voters with a very hard trade-off and others with a very easy trade-off between democracy and policy. If you take scenarios like these and you look at how voters rate candidate 1 versus candidate 2, this is the distribution you get. We call this candidates 1 partisan advantage. That is, how much did the voter like candidate 1 as opposed to candidate 2 just based on their partisanship. Before these surveys, everybody rated all of the parties that will be seen in these scenarios. So we know exactly how far those two parties were from the voter's point of view. One thing that's prominent here is that in most of these scenarios, the voters saw exactly no difference between the two candidates. This may be somewhat specific to the European context, because in multi-party systems, many voters would only consider voting for one or two parties, and the rest of them are equally bad. But crucially, what it means is that if we just take all of these scenarios, it means that a lot of voters will face no trade-off. And then some extreme trade-offs. They will like candidate 1 much more than candidate 2. So what do we do in a baseline version of this analysis? We subset all contests between a candidate you like, here defined as the candidate that you would vote for if an election were held today, and a candidate you don't like, some other candidate. And as you can see now, we are imposing a reasonable price on siding with democracy. Now, how you rate the two parties is almost always positive. So in other words, we're normalizing or equalizing the price we're asking you to pay to side with democracy over partisanship when we're showing you these scenarios. Our final bit of formalism, okay? And so this is the quantity that we'll be looking at. So what we will be looking at is, first of all, what is the vote share of your in-party, that is the party that you like, when both candidates are perfectly democratic? So that is, at baseline, how often do you as a voter vote for the party that you like versus that you don't like? It's not always 100%. It's roughly 80% or so. And then we will ask, and how often are you still voting for that party if your favorite candidate, candidate 1, is undemocratic? We take the difference divided by the baseline, and we have the percentage of individuals who are willing to abandon a candidate that they would normally vote for if that candidate is undemocratic. And this is the key quantity we care about. Are you willing to abandon a candidate you would normally vote for if that candidate does something undemocratic? And specifically, what share of such individuals do we have in the population? But crucially, if we use these support for democracy questions, at each scale value of a particular measure, what is that share? And so let me show you an example of one such measure. All right, so first of all, here's the overall quantity. Oops. Here's the overall. On average, in this European sample, the delta the defection rate is roughly 10%. Right? So that means roughly 10% of individuals overall are willing to abandon a candidate that they would normally vote for if that candidate proposes one of those undemocratic positions. And so the question for this methodological exercise is, if you say 10 out of 10, do you actually do better than that 10%? Right? Are you the kind of individual that on the how important question is actually willing to defect more than the average person? And so here's the answer. All right, so here's the how important question. All right, so these quantities are describing that D minus punishment rate. So how often you're defecting. And there are several things that are, I think, interesting here. So first of all, we now have a behavioral counterpart of what it means to say 10 out of 10. Right? We know that if you said 10 out of 10 over there, that means that your defection rate is roughly 14, 13%. Better than 10, so you're defecting at a higher rate. Right? Down here, it gets all the way close to indistinguishable from zero. Okay. But I think that already should change our benchmark for what it means when somebody says 10 out of 10. After all, this question is phrased in the following way. How important is it for you to live in a country that's governed democratically? On the scale where 1 means not at all important and 10 means absolutely important. How absolutely important? Well, 1 in 10 times, right? So that's a very different interpretation of what the question could mean when you just take it at its face value. Engelhardt, about a quarter century ago, he has this statement where he's also writing about these measures where he says, so far we have been primarily relying on face validity when interpreting these measures. And I think this is important. Face validity could be misguiding us. Absolutely important is 1 out of 10 times, right? So something very different than you would expect. Another important thing that I will emphasize in a minute is that nonetheless, you can see that the defection rate is increasing in the measure, right? From a good measure, you would want it to be increasing in commitment to democracy, so that we can conclude that if you say 10 out of 10, you are actually supporting democracy more than somebody who says 6 out of 10. And that is true about this measure. So one more point about face validity. So there's another item that we frequently use as political scientists. So how good or bad would you say is a political system that's described as having a strong leader who does not have to bother with parliamentary elections, right? This is often cited in the popular press, political scientists use it, and it's a measure that's supposed to capture somehow one's openness to authoritarianism. If you say this is a really good system, then you are the kind of voter who's open to authoritarian leadership. All right, so here's a quote from The Atlantic. Surveys have shown a worrying decline in Americans' commitment to democracy. In 1995, 75% of Americans found the notion of having a strong leader who does not have to bother with Congress or elections undesirable. In 2017, just 62% rejected it. The number of authoritarian voters is growing in the United States and around the world. So here's this measure reordered so that when you say very bad, that means you are supporting democracy. When you say very good, that means you are supporting authoritarianism. And this is its plot. So first of all, if you say very bad again, you are actually defecting at a positive rate. Another good news is that, again, increasing. So it is true that if somebody says that system is very bad, as opposed to very good, that individual actually is defecting from candidates who undermine democracy at a higher rate. But crucially, note at this very end, right? This is supposed to be an authoritarian, right? But crucially, it is not somebody who is actually rewarding authoritarianism. If they were rewarding authoritarianism, then instead of defecting from politicians who undermine democracy, they would be flocking toward them. That would mean that the defection rate would be in the negative territory. It is not. It is not even overlapping with zero, right? So here, if you think, based on the item's phrasing, that somehow this is capturing authoritarian voters, well, it's not. Right? In fact, in that how important item, that lower end was overlapping with zero. Here, it's strictly positive. In substantive terms, that's actually good news. Right? It means there are actually not that many voters, at least we haven't seen them really yet, who actually reward authoritarianism. It just means that there are some who are close to indifferent about democracy, and certainly some who support democracy, even if not as high as we thought. So this would indicate that there's a lot of cheap talk when people answer these questions, that they overstate their support for democracy. Orwell has this statement that we're in the politics of the English language, where he says something like, if we want to praise a country, we call it democratic. And then in a few words he says, or a few sentences he says, words like these are used intentionally in a dishonest way. Right? And so could it be that our survey respondents, when asked, how important is it for you to live in a country democratically, are intentionally overstating their support for democracy? And that a lot of what they're saying is cheap talk. It's easy to say support for democracy, but what if the test is somewhere else? And so here, did you add?
Could it be just the saliency of what democracy is? Like, do any of these surveys ask people what is democracy? I kind of feel like many would not be able to actually connect your questions as democratic versus undemocratic. There are things that they can read in the specific examples, like this is probably not okay to do, but the democracy kind of from that abstract perspective might just not be salient enough. They know it's a good word, right? They should say yes, but they might not actually really think about what that means.
Yes, so some surveys do ask a battery of questions that say, and what does democracy mean for you? And then they offer some potentially sort of misleading things like, oh, high rates of economic growth, or conceptually inconsistent answers. And a lot of people will give those answers. For me, though, it's not necessarily evidence of the fact that people misunderstand democracy. Because, I mean, if you ask me if I want economic growth in the survey, I mean, I'm going to say yes, right? Like, I might be picky on it, but my answer no, right? What we did in this survey, for instance, is when you saw those different undemocratic positions, we asked, prior to administering these candidate choice experiments, we phrased each of them as being from somewhere around the world. I'm going too far here. I think I'm almost there. And we said something like, the president of this country decided to prosecute journalists who accused him of corruption. So we on purpose presented it as not from their country, but somewhere else early in the survey. And we asked, and please rate this on a scale from 0 to 10, how democratic this action is. And then we also had some other items that were perfectly democratic, like, about this many voters in this country actually don't turn out to vote in elections. So maybe undesirable, but nothing about whether it's democratic or not, it's just a fact. And it is true that by our count, there's about 20 to 30% of individuals who score low on this kind of test. But the remaining 70% kind of get it right, like a majority, and that's good news, can differentiate undemocratic things from democratic things. So certainly there is a fraction of a society who just, has a different understanding of democracy than we do as political scientists, but they are not a majority. Now, this data that I'm going to show you is from the United States. And the advantage of that data is that this is from 2022, that each individual faced 12 choices that were always between an in-partisan candidate and an out-partisan candidate. And in the experimental condition, it's the in-partisan that would always be undemocratic. So each individual basically faced a choice between a Democrat and a Republican. And then if you were a Democrat, then 2 weeks later, that Democratic candidate would propose something undemocratic, and you faced exactly the same choice. And what we were looking at is, are you willing to abandon the Democrat for a perfectly democratically acting Republican, and the other way around? Because it's 12 choices, we can have a revealed preference measure that's simply the number of times that you were willing to vote against that in-partisan when that in-partisan did something undemocratic. And that's what I'm plotting over here. This is the how important question in the United States. Right? It doesn't look very different from Europe. In fact, it's maybe even better than Sweden. As in the 10 out of 10 is a plurality. It's more than 50% of Americans say 10 out of 10. Now look what it translates to when you look at their actions, right? Attitudes versus actions. The modal response here is 0 out of 12, always voting with my party, no matter if they're Democratic or not. All right, so in other words, we previously thought maybe we need to recalibrate our interpretation of these measures because even absolutely important, 10 out of 10, it means more like 13, 14%. Here, what it means is that we also need to recalibrate our understanding of the breadth of support, of how widespread support for democracy is. These plots are mirror images of each other. If you, like I, trust more the revealed preference, then most people couldn't care less about democracy. And there are some, so those who choose a majority of the time at least to defect from an undemocratic and partisan, who do care. But that fraction is much smaller, and it gets worse. So this is the joint distribution for the two. So this is how you answered that attitudinal measure, how important. This is how you did on that revealed preference measure. If you go up, you are more siding with democracy. If you go this way, your attitudes say you care more about democracy. Most individuals are in this part of the plot. That's the 10 out of 10 individuals. But now the modal cell in this 10 times 13 plot is this cell down here. What is this cell? This is somebody who says 10 out of 10, but votes against an undemocratic and partisan exactly 0 times out of 12. All right, so the modal individual is the individual who on the attitudinal measure expresses the maximum support for democracy, and on the revealed preference measure does the least amount of democratic action, right? So in other words, when we hear 10 out of 10, most of the time we're hearing BS, right? It's somebody who is cheap talking, who is actually completely unwilling to abandon a candidate from their party when that candidate acts undemocratic.
Curiosity, have you broken this down by partisanship?
Yes. Yes, I don't have a plot like that here, but in the United States in 2022, this is data from 2022, there is some asymmetry between Democrats and Republicans. And it's something that you would expect. If the undemocratic action is something like denies an election outcome or something like that, Republicans are willing to tolerate that, not Democrats. Around 2020 before, so surveys done at 2020 or before, there's actually a fair amount of symmetry between Democrats and Republicans. What it says to me is that Republicans have adopted Trump's big lie as something that, in some sense, they both don't care about as an undemocratic action, but also in some sense, so in some surveys not shown here, we find that actually they reward candidates that do that. And the way I see it is basically, this is a, that's one sign of a Trump Republican candidate, right? Like is that he endorses the big lie. So in other words, some asymmetry, primarily after 2020, not before that.
It seems like it may not be completely fair to interpret people in that lower right cell to have anti-democratic attitudes because it depends on what the alternative is. So if you ask Democrats, like, are you willing to defect from Harris if she does something undemocratic? But that's sort of like asking, would you vote for Trump instead? And it's hard to argue that that's an anti-democratic thing because it might seem clear to someone that Trump is the least democratic alternative, even if Harris has an undemocratic policy on some particular thing.
So I agree with you. So this was phrased as a congressional race in your district. So like suppose these two candidates are running in your district. But I completely agree that especially after Trump's first term, a Democrat could say, even if my party is behaving undemocratically, the other party would never do anything differently. And so even if in the experiment that Republican is described as perfectly compliant with democratic principles, maybe I think I agree. I think, now what if I show you a similar graph, but not from the United States, but from Germany? I think that would be more problematic because we haven't seen real undermining of democracy in Germany. But what if it turns out that a Christian Democrat is also unwilling to abandon that party in favor of, let's say, a social democrat? I think that would, I agree with that. So maybe we should not focus so much on the US in this example, precisely for that reason. But I agree, I think it's in some sense saying that there's a confounding between the real world and what are we showing people in that experimental choice scenario.
It was,
Yeah. And so the reason we picked this example in the US is that in the United States, because of its two-party system, it's so easy to construct what you could call a symmetrical stress test, right? Because it's easy who the in out is, even though 1/3 of the sample are independents, they call themselves independents. In that case, we randomized in versus out. So maybe just based on the US case, here I think is the starkest finding. So if you classify individuals into those who attitudinally support democracy, so that's yes versus no. If you were 6 or above, you support democracy by the how important measure. If you're 5 or below, you not. And then based on the revealed preference measure, if you voted against an undemocratic, impartisan, more often than not, then you are coded as supporting democracy versus not. The largest cell is this one, right? As in the figure, you say yes when it comes to the attitude, but you act like somebody who actually doesn't support the democracy. So roughly, Susan Hyde has this term pseudo-democrats. And this is how I would describe this cell. These are pseudo-democrats. Right? They are saying they support democracy, but when it comes to action, they actually don't act accordingly. But know that there's very few pseudo-authoritarians, right? Only 3% in the overall population. In other words, this is something important. When somebody says they couldn't care less about democracy, they actually mean it, right? So these measures are not useless. In the bottom half of that measure, when there's not many individuals in that bottom half, but when you're there, we should listen to you because you really mean it. So let me maybe briefly conclude just saying that we also evaluate these measures by formal statistical criteria. There are three types of attributes that we would want from these measures. One we call monotonicity. I already alluded to it. You would ideally want to measure that if somebody scores higher on that measure, the attitudinal measure, then they in real life are more likely defecting from undemocratic candidates. We would also want a wide coverage. That is, ideally that measure would cover a broad range of D- defection rates so that you can both identify individuals who don't support democracy and who really support democracy. And finally, something we call discriminating power. You would ideally have as many fine subsets of levels of commitment to democracy that a measure identifies. And so let me briefly conclude with what we find. So on monotonicity, we find two measures that are simply not monotonic, even by what we call the weakest monotonicity criterion. So this is one of them. This is the measure that I said is the most frequently measured item in cross-national surveys. How satisfied are you with how democracy works in your country? One example of usage, Bartos, in a book on democratic backsliding, says, all of this talk of a crisis of democracy does sound portentous, but at least insofar as the attitudes and preferences of ordinary Europeans are concerned, virtually none of it is true. On the whole, Europeans were just as satisfied with the working of democracy in 2019 as they had been 15 years earlier. So he's saying, because we don't see a shift in satisfaction with democracy, we don't need to be worried about democracy. It's the opposite tone that we usually see in this literature, as I said previously. So this is how this defection rate graph looks for this measure. It's essentially flat. And not only that, it fails what we call our minimal monotonicity criterion. And that criterion simply asks that individuals who score at the highest scale value of the measure defect from candidates who undermine democracy more than those who score at the lowest end of that scale, right? For this measure, we can't even conclude that whoever is scored as the most supporting individual actually tolerates undemocratic candidates less than the individual at the bottom of that scale. In fact, if you will look, you see that those who score the highest, actually there's a little kink there where they actually are defecting less from candidates who undermine democracy. And I think part of the answer why this is happening is that, well, if during the peace government in Poland, you ask a peace supporter whether they're satisfied with democracy, they will say they are very satisfied with democracy. because the party they really like is in power and it's also undemocratic, but who cares, right? So in other words, this question seems to say nothing about democracy, but maybe about, are you happy with who's in power? Right? And so we think this is a question that should be avoided and never interpreted as saying anything about one's commitment to democracy. Something similar holds for the having experts item. Right? This is kind of an exotic item because it says it measures technocracy, presumably, and might measure how much you like technocracy, but it, at least if you look at this graph, measures nothing about your commitment to democracy. Right? It probably measures whether you like experts, but just like for the previous item here, those who score highest on this measure, as in they should be most supportive of democracy, actually defect from candidates who undermine democracy the least. So the remaining items do well on monotonicity. There's one more item that does poorly on what we call coverage. That is, what is the broadest range of defection rates that you can detect? And the one item that does poorly is this, is this one. Democracy may have problems, but it is better than any other form of government. This is the so-called Churchill item. The idea behind this item seems to have been, maybe if we acknowledge that democracy has problems, people will be more genuinely expressing whether they really support democracy or not. What happens instead is that this item is monotonic, but it has a very narrow range. Note that the top value seems to be somewhere around 13%, and the lowest defection rate it detects is somewhere about 7%. Compare this to the other items in this pattern, right? So they are similarly shaped, but much broader coverage, much broader range of values that they cover. Once we saw this, we thought this is another interesting example where face validity is a poor guide toward, will the measure actually perform well? And one way I interpret what's happening is that a respondent who doesn't like democracy, who doesn't care about democracy, focuses on this part of the statement. Democracy may have face problems. Yes, I agree. If you really care about democracy, you are focusing on this part, but it's better than any other form of government. And so in other words, we are conflating individuals because both the type of individual who couldn't care less about democracy agrees and the individual who supports democracy agrees. And so we end up with a more compressed range of values than we would ideally have. So my final point, we also look at what we call discriminating power. And I can get into the statistics, but basically the idea is to figure out, measure by measure, what is the largest number of distinct levels of commitment to democracy, meaning distinct D- defection rates, that measure can identify. And what we find really interesting is that regardless of the measure, if it's what we call a well-performing measure, so not how satisfied, not having experts, not the Churchill item, they all identify at most 3 distinct levels of commitment to democracy. How important has 10 scale values? But what we find is actually there's really only 3 levels of democracy that those 10 scale values identify. Anything below 5 or 6 is just, you don't care about democracy. Then there's some range in between. And then if you're at 8 or 9, you support democracy at a higher level. I think that's interesting. It means it doesn't matter how many scale values you have, all of these measures in effect are able to differentiate between people who really support democracy, those in the middle, and those who don't care. Right? And so that's the formal assessment. We do a lot of robustness checks and so on. So for instance, we look at cross-country coherence. That is, are there some measures that perform particularly well in some countries or others? Are the results the same across countries? What we find is that measures that perform poorly, like how satisfied, show the greatest variability across countries. And the Polish example is how we would expect. If there's an undemocratic party in power, then supporters the voters who are willing to tolerate a lot of undemocratic stuff are also most satisfied with democracy and so on. We use some machine learning based approaches to basically we use an alternative statistical technique to conduct what in effect is what's heterogeneity analysis of causal effects, right? Because what we're trying to identify, how much of a causal effect does a candidate's endorsing an undemocratic position have on an outcome, and can we slice the population, that is create a heterogeneity? And that's an alternative approach that we use to confirm that what we have really is the case. We look at, could it possibly be that these items pick up different dimensions of democracy? Overall, the answer is not really, but if anything, they pick up electoral fairness somewhat more than anything else. And is there a benefit to combining multiple measures? This is a frequent practice in the analysis of these measures where people will pull them together, create an index or something like that. We show that, yes, there is some benefit. You can construct a measure that's more monotonic, so steeper, has broader coverage, and has more discriminating ability if you combine measures. And we use the ML approaches to identify precisely how you should combine measures. It's not exactly intuitive what the ML approach finds. And I think that's where its advantages. It finds something that we as researchers wouldn't devise by ourselves. I would be interested in knowing what you would want from a study like this. Something we already want to do is say, first of all, if you could only use one measure, which one should it be? Right? And our answer is actually the other way around. If you should avoid a measure, it should be how satisfied, it should be having experts, and possibly the Churchill eye. Right? But when it comes to the remaining four, you just as well using any of them. How important item actually does perform slightly better on discriminating power under some circumstances. How should you interpret scale values? My main message was basically be very careful about over-interpreting the wording and the scale values like something absolutely important or the strong leader item. And should you combine them? Yes, although not in a very intuitive way. And so as a practical recommendation, we're not sure whether we would actually recommend that you combine them. I can show you the graph. We were also interested in testing the external validity of these candidate choice experiments. So for instance, when you look at these European parties, the European study, it is the case that candidate choice experiments predict way better than the attitudinal measures. For instance, whether you will vote for an illiberal party like the lot of the far-right parties in Europe. And so the way we are using it is basically we're trying to establish that these candidate choice experiments are a better benchmark than just the face validity of these attitudinal measures. And my last point, we also conduct a very, technically speaking, a very similar kind of analysis, where rather than looking at these measures of support for democracy, we instead ask the following question. What is it that I could ask about you that best predicts whether you're going to be the kind of individual that defects from an impartisan who acts undemocratically, as opposed to stays with him? And we basically take every single thing you can measure in a survey in a very agnostic, atheoretical way and ask which attribute predicts best that you're the kind of individuals who is willing to defect from an undemocratic impartisan. And a lot of these gray lines in this plot show that the vast majority of things you can measure don't predict anything. And there are only three things here in red that actually predict best whether you're the kind of individual who's willing to abandon an partisan who acts undemocratically. So I'll stop there.
I will take a cue. Well, I think the time is exhausted. Lakshmi, I'll start with you.
So question, do people, this defection rate, does it vary by the type of question you ask? Some of the questions you asked are actual actions committed by the candidate, like they went and disrupted an opposition rally, or says promises. If I get elected, I will do this. Is there a differential reaction from respondents?
So now that we could see, right, like if we categorize these as described as having said or proposed or having done, not really, no. But I think your point is valid, that is that these are not uniformly phrased.
Right.
And could this make a difference? And so when we tested, no, we couldn't find it.
Thomas Stolo?
Thanks, Scott. Thanks, Milan. First of all, what are the three? But more importantly, I was wondering, so these measures, like the not important one that are used so often in explanatory kind of projects, maybe as an outcome, or like, how would you characterize, I guess what you're doing here, well, I'm wondering what the implications are for those projects. And that means asking like, well, what kind of like error is this? I guess you're characterizing it in some ways statistically, those three properties you described, but is it like, it's a measurement error, would you say? Like this overestimation of tens, for example? And is it systematic or is it like, is it gonna generate overconfidence in the findings in the literature, the people that are using it? Or is it is it maybe conservative? Have you thought about this?
Yes, so I really, I would like this to be, it's both like an empirical sort of methodological exercise, but I would like there to be practical implications. And I think one of them should be that two things. First of all, yes, you risk overstating the level of support for democracy, especially if you take them really the scale values at their face value, absolutely important. So researchers should be much more careful in calibrating their conclusions. The discriminatory power analysis, for instance, says that 10 and 9, and I think in some versions 8, are that high level of support for democracy. 7 through 6, 5 is the middling level, and then below that, it's that low level. And so what it means for practical purposes is that, for instance, if you just construct a mean, well, that actually is not the mean of the levels of democracy, because anything below 5 is actually the same kind of indifference toward democracy. And so I think, I don't know if you remember, there was a debate by Foy and Munk in the Journal of Democracy, where they have shown that in Europe, average support for democracy has declined. But they have measured as somebody supporting democracy only if they answer 10 out of 10 on the how important scale measure, right? And so, well, is that a valid decision? And I think this analysis implies, well, actually, it depends. Like, we don't see any measurable difference between 10 and 9, for instance. So if it has only dropped to 9 across Europe, that's fine. But if individuals are now afraid to say 4 out of 10, that's a huge difference, right? So in other words, there are both non-linearities and non-obvious interpretive, ways to interpret an average decline by this much in this measure. Like think about the difference between Estonia and Sweden, which was all behind a decimal point. So I think that's one of them. I think the most important one is don't ever use how satisfied and interpret this as measuring anything about support for democracy or democratic resilience of the public. And this is a very frequent use. So I think that's probably like what to avoid is probably the most practical recommendation.
And what are the three? Sorry, what are the three?
So the three, so note that among the demographics, there's close to nothing. So here, the red ones are the so-called items that are significant enough that they satisfy the so-called Bonferroni correction for testing multiple hypotheses. So in other words, here we're testing about 40 different interaction effects, what it ends up statistically speaking. And so we need to have a highest standard for statistical significance. And so nothing on demographics. Then there is one personality attribute. And so wait a second. So I'm showing you the wrong graph. Let me see if I can find it.
Are you controlling for those in the baseline estimations?
For
the-
Yes. So we always have a baseline version of a covariate. And what we are basically asking, so I think the simplest example is on gender. Like, does male or female better predicting being somebody who's willing to defect from an undemocratic position? I am showing you, I apologize. I'm showing you a graph that I erroneously, this is Singapore. This is only one country, Singapore, and that one has a slightly different characteristics. So let me answer the question for the overall European sample. For the overall European sample, there are 3 predictors. One is kind of obvious, and that's what we call democratic competence. So that is, if you are, as I mentioned earlier, correctly identifying democratic positions as democratic, undemocratic as undemocratic, you do really well. So if you're competent democratically, you punish undemocratic behavior at a high rate. But the 2 other ones are not so obvious. The first of these, and the one that actually has a lot of explanatory power, is the so-called child rearing battery for the authoritarian personality. This is a battery of 4 questions phrased in the following way. Would you prefer your child to be curious or well-behaved? If you answered well-behaved, then you're an authoritarian. And then you are unlikely, you express a greater tolerance for candidates who undermine democracy. The other item is by the way, personally, I until we conducted this analysis, I thought these were incredibly frustrating survey items. Now I think they're the best thing ever because they come up significant. The other item, which I was always frustrated with, is the so-called generalized trust question. So this is the question that says, in general, do you think people can be trusted or you can't be too careful? If you answer, can't be too careful, you're also on the wrong side of history, meaning you are also the kind of person who is willing to tolerate undemocratic behavior. This one, so with the authoritarian personality, I think we can kind of connect that kind of attitude toward your predisposition, let's say, to be more tolerant of relationships of authority, hierarchy, a less tolerance for disagreement, and so on. With the trust question, I think it's really hard to come up with an immediate explanation of why somebody who is more trusting as opposed to not is the kind of individual who is more or less willing to tolerate candidates who undermine democracy. There, I think it's a bigger puzzle. And I really, so by the way, so these are correlational, right? These are predictors. We have not manipulated them, and so we cannot establish a causal effect. But it's a really large one. And especially with the trust question, I think the issue becomes, so what is it really measuring? What is it really tapping into? Such that it should translate into you being willing to tolerate a politician who undermines democracy.
More trusting people are more willing to tolerate undermining?
The other way around. So the distrustful people are open to authoritarianism in this version, as in tolerating politicians who undermine democracy. If you look at cross-country correlations, you know, the Nordics in Europe are very trusting. The South and the East, very not trusting. So in this sample, it kind of correlates with the things we know. It's just not clear why. Because it's really hard to connect trust to you being faced with two candidates in a scenario. One of them proposes something undemocratic, right? It's not clear that there's a causal connection. Luis?
Yeah, well, thank you, Milan. This was brilliant. I wanted to follow up on what Michael raised more generally, right? So it strikes me that, and going back to what you're just saying, right, out people's intrinsic, values, right? The abstract definition of democracy goes towards your values, right? But a lot of the actions that you describe in these conjoints are about specific actions, right? So I wonder how context affects people's beliefs about what's appropriate to satisfy a democratic norm, right? So the opponent might matter, but more broadly, right, it could be that in a given context, if there has been an episode of prior attempts at democratic backsliding, right, the actions that you deem appropriate with it. So I think your mentioning of Germany, your response to Michael was very useful, but in general, I think that it would be useful to see, how context and the past of backsliding drive people beliefs, given that you're going from norms to beliefs. And there are just very quick comment related to what Tom said. I think it would be useful to add an analysis of how well these existing measures predict things that we know should predict. Because if it's pure measurement error, or if it's just systematic bias, it would be useful, I think, for a methodological piece to suggest what measures. Because my sense is that a lot of these measures, even though they might overstate support for democracy, they're still useful, right? Because they show variance. The variance seems to be kind of related to things we care about, and they're useful, like regressions predicting like vote choice and things like that. So I think that would be a nice piece to add.
So in the last point, be the dependent variable or the independent variable that we should be looking at. Because, for instance, I just told you that actually, when it comes to predicting what kind of individual will be willing to abandon a partisan who acts undemocratically, that, for instance, their income actually doesn't matter. Right? Like that's one of the points. Like, it's the authoritarian personality, it's trust, and it's democratic competence, or where they're in the distribution of income also doesn't matter. So we are in some sense saying that, so as a part of this exercise, we compare the standard predictors of attitudinally measured support for democracy and compare them to predictors of revealed preference measures of democracy. And so, for instance, income does, and education does predict attitudinally measured support for democracy. Maybe because people who are educated and have a high income know that in polite society, you say 10 out of 10, right? Right? But how they act in the voting booth, that may be a different thing. So in some sense, we could show you that actually on some measures, there is actually a strong disconnect between what we as political scientists usually think predicts support for democracy and what these measures, reveal preference measures, reveal about who actually is willing to abandon undemocratic active politicians. So we could do that kind of contrast.
I was thinking more about vote for authoritarian candidates, things
That we do. We have that. So for instance, as I mentioned, in Europe, for instance, it turns out that these revealed preference measures do better at predicting vote for the far right. If you call the far right as a real world instantiation of illiberal attitudes, illiberal here in the democratic sense of the word, they do better than these attitudinal measures. We were also playing with the idea of looking who among Republicans supports the big lie or votes for Trump. But crucially among Republicans, right? Like, so to subset it to the kind of individuals for whom that candidate is partisan, and do the attitudinal as opposed to revealed preference measures better allow us to understand who is saying, and this is too far, this is too much. So that would be more of an external validity test. That's how I would interpret it. On context, so when I said cross-country coherence, there are two ways we do it. One way we do it, we literally plot all of these graphs, country by country, stare at them, and ask the question, do they look significantly different across countries? And as I mentioned, the how satisfied item does. The how important item, not so much. So I'm reducing the word context here to country label. And if you are even more reductive about it, as in you literally plug in country dummies into a regression, and ask the question, does the dummy pick up anything that is not picked up by all of these predictors? It turns out that it's not Sweden that's special, but actually Poland that is special, for instance, in this analysis. That Poles actually do, given where their baseline covariates are, they actually support democracy more than they should be. In some sense, Poland should be a more authoritarian society than it is, whereas Sweden should be just as democratic as it is. But I don't know how to go further into context. I think something like denying election outcomes obviously has become very contextual in places like the United States or Brazil. Elsewhere not. So some of these D- positions could have outsized contextual relevance in some places than others. Jessica?
Yeah, thank you. Thank you for your talk, Professor. It was really interesting. I guess it's also like a follow-up. Because I was trying to think about how this experiment translates or like works in contexts where you have like multi-party systems and when you have like districts magnitudes that are greater than one, right? And so as I was just thinking on like the case of like the useful vote, how do we deal with that? Like maybe I have this candidate that I think is more democratic, but maybe I will throw my vote away because there's no like virtual chance that this candidate is gonna win. So I'm gonna vote to the least like the one that supports democracy a little more, not as much as my candidate would, but a little more than the opposition. So how do we deal with the useful vote in this context?
So I think there are two separate issues. And one issue is, I think that in a multi-party system, you are almost by construction asked to pay a lower price for defecting from an in-partisan, undemocratic candidate than in a two-party system, right? Like think about the contemporary United States where it's really just between a Democrat and a Republican. Whereas in a multi-party system, in Turkey, for instance, well, if you're conservative, socially speaking, moderate Islamist in Turkey, and you don't like the AKP, well, the E party in Turkey is an opposition, but also a moderate Islamist party, right? And so you have an alternative, but crucially what it means that therefore you are not asked to pay as a high ideological price for defecting. So you should be more likely to defect. And actually that's what we find, like so we don't do the comparison between multi-party or not, but we do find that if you defect in a multi-party system, you do meaningfully defect to a party that's close to you on policy preferences, right? So you don't jump from the AKP to the CHP, the secular socialists. You defect from the pro-democratic, but still moderate Islam party, right? And that makes sense. That also somewhat validates the spatial framework in that simple model that I outlined. It also means that therefore these places should in some sense have an easier time sustaining democracy because more people are willing to abandon candidates because they have more neighboring choices available to them. Crucially for the methods part of this, it also means that they're asked to pay a lower price. So it's not as a stringent test as it is in the United States, right? So it's not the same level of a democracy stress test that we're stressing voters with when we do it in Turkey as opposed to the United States. And actually, I think actually, and at that level, it's actually almost impossible to do comparative politics, as in we can never equate that price quite exactly between Turkey and the United States, because you can't meaningfully construct a two-party Turkey and present it to a respondent. You can easily construct a two-party United States, right? It's right here.
Luis Fraga?
Thank you for an intriguing project. Congratulations on that and an even more intriguing presentation. I have a question about your sampling design. Does it allow you to make significant distinctions based upon gender, race, or ethnicity? I'm coming at this from the perspective of an Americanist, where issues of the gender gap and differences by race and ethnicity in terms of partisan support and changing patterns of partisan support and so forth become significant. Just wondered what your analysis allows us to explore, if not actually be much more informed by than some of the surveys that we've had in the past.
So the type of analysis that we conduct is that each respondent sees about 12 to 20 something of these scenarios. In the United States, we on purpose try to impose more structure than just unconditional randomization of attributes, as in the respondent sees roughly the same times Democrats being undemocratic as Republicans being undemocratic. So to have a certain equality, again, like a parity in the stress test. The two-party system makes that easy. And by now in the US, I think I must have at least 200,000 choices, 300,000 choices.
Are they
So-
always male?
Ooh,
The candidates.
Oh, so we only in some of them assign a gender to the candidate. But one intriguing finding from these kind of experiments when it comes to focusing on the question of gender is actually that voters seem to slightly prefer female candidates to male candidates in these candidate choice scenarios. This goes contra to what seems to be happening based on observational data from real life. We don't always assign gender. So for instance, in this European study that I've shown you, gender was not assigned. In part, this is to narrow down the amount of information that the respondent is faced with to essentially policy issues and that democracy attribute. But we did have race and demographics. But I wasn't sure, is your question about the race and demographics of the respondent or is it of the candidates? Because with the respondents, we can do a lot. Like we have them, and these are not, when you think about the factorial product of gender, race, and so on, it's not such a big deal to construct all possible demographic samples. So for instance, what we find is that women support democracy slightly more by these revealed preference measures. When it comes to, I don't have an answer when it comes to race. I actually don't know the exact how it shakes down. Older people, less than younger people.
Education.
Education, no, doesn't come up. Age, but even age and gender disappears once we do the Bonferroni correction. And it's only those three things: the authoritarian personality, trust, and democratic competence. Which is that's what I find really interesting, is that these three things trump everything else when it comes to predictors.
Aniva?
Milan, thanks for the presentation. I'm always impressed of how insightful your work is. I have a question that follows on Michael's question and to some extent on Lisa's question. About, I guess, about the meaning of that delta term, right? It seems to me that when you discuss it, when you think about it, you are measuring some sort of underlying attitude of commitment to democracy. There is some entrenched personality trait,
Yes.
to some extent. But we could also think of many situations in which attitudes toward democracy emerge in a sort of security dilemma, right, in which I value democracy, but if I know that you're going to win, the losses, the democratic losses are going to be irreversible. So I'm willing my party to do some cheating, so to prevent the much worse situation, which is you coming to power. And I was wondering to what extent you are able to discriminate what that delta term means in terms of whether it is we're thinking about entrenched attitudes or some sort of strategic response to the context, because the revealed preference only tells you so much.
So I agree with you. So I agree with you as in we should be able to say more about this delta over alpha. And what is it? So I'm not going to go all the way back in the slides, but there was that delta over alpha inequality that I showed you at some point. And what does that say? That says, I on purpose have those formalisms because I think what it says is that delta on its own doesn't make much sense. That's how much you care about democracy. It only makes sense relative to how much you care about alpha. Alpha is how much you care about policy, right? That's the only, so these experiments, what they allow us to do is to estimate that delta over alpha for subgroups and in some cases for individuals. And crucially, they mean two things always. How do you care about democracy relative to how much you care about partisanship policy and these other things? And that's the emphasis in the experiment on, are you willing to abandon a candidate you would normally vote for partisan reasons, when that candidate acts undemocratic? We can slice it into a finer deltas if we, let's say, subset to only violations of electoral integrity, as opposed to checks and balances, as opposed to civil liberties. So we can have like domain-specific deltas while holding alphas constant, right? So we can do that. And in general, the finding is that people care more about electoral integrity than anything else. Civil liberties usually, but not always, are the thing that people care least about. In some sense, I think that's actually good news. It says elections, which we think about elections as a fundamental aspect of or attribute, the fundamental institution of democracy, people really care about it. But what else is it about, actually, like what goes into it? I think and I'm really trying to be here, like, not say what I think, but rather what comes out of the data. I think the most I can say about it is that that delta ultimately has to be something like, and so this refers to the three things that I said, predict democracy when we do that exercise. Capacity times predisposition. Capacity, as in when I said democratic competence is one of these things that predicts your ability, your willingness to abandon undemocratic candidates. So I guess that delta should actually is not, technically speaking, a single term. It's rather some interaction effect, and it interacts with your capacity as a voter to even differentiate undemocratic from democratic. And I think it's a real thing, as in we see it in the data. I said about 20 to 30% of individuals are scored as not democratically competent. But there's so many times that I give talks to American politics audiences that tell me that gerrymandering is politics as usual. Right? Like, as in, that's not really undemocratic, that's constitution, right? Right? And so it's like the interaction term that I refer to is that there's predisposition, and I think that's what we really mean by delta. And then there's capacity, as in, are you actually able to, when it's out there, tell the undemocratic from the democratic? But now, if the things that most strongly predict predisposition are the authoritarian personality and that trust question, what do we do with that? Right? I mean, it's not a causal relationship because we are unable to infer it. It's just the strongest predictor. But it's really hard, I think, to say like, okay, so the authoritarian personality could be something about very conceptually abstract relations of hierarchy. But that trust question, I don't know how to put any meaningful mechanism onto it. About your other question, so is there some kind of security dilemma going on? I think yes, absolutely. I think once one party undermines democracy, it allows the other side to say, hey, if I were punishing my side for behaving undemocratically, along the lines that Michael suggested, if I were punishing them by defecting to the other side that in the past has acted undemocratically, all I would be doing is facilitating undemocratic behavior by the side in politics that I actually disagree with, not only on democracy grounds, but also on policy grounds, right? It's in some sense, and I shamefully, as in self-advertising, I do have a paper along those lines. And there's also another paper out there that tries to measure this in the case of the US. So it's a model that tries to show how this works. It's called partisan mistrust and the erosion of democratic norms. But basically, this is the mechanism that it tries to model. But I would say in terms of the validity of this research design, it should still be perfectly fine in places like Sweden, Germany, or other places where we can reasonably claim that this kind of cycle of mutual democratic distrust is not the mechanism driving why you might be willing to side with an undemocratic candidate. I think experimentally, I think it's worth testing. Like I haven't seen a good research design that would get at the, reverberating effects of this, which is that so the worst case scenario here is, even if you are committed to democracy, you're going to say, I know I'm committed to democracy and I would punish anyone, any candidate, in fact, from any candidate who undermines democracy, but I can't afford to do that. Right? Like, because I know that the other side is never going to play by my standard. And so I have to sink to a lower standard. And so I think that's the worst case scenario. That's like the security dilemma type scenario.
Well, I'd like to emphasize the problem of doing comparative analysis for these kinds of surveys and statistics. I did a survey in Chile in which I disaggregated the Latino barometer of Juan Lin's question into the conceptual part and the contingent part. And so first I asked the conceptual part to place the interviewees in the framework, and then the specific contextual part with, well, if there's a serious problem with democracy, would you support a military coup, blah, blah, blah. The regression results showed that, and I would have said, without looking further, the right is not democratic. The left, yes. But then I went back and I looked at the raw numbers. 68% of people on the right said that they would do that they would, well, support a military coup or 93% of people on the left said they would never. And so if you just look at the regression results, you would be telling a story that is not true, right? A story that, well, people on the right are more supportive of non-democratic means. The story there is that there's a contingent historical effect. People on the right are saying, well, my dad supported, you see?
So I would defend this research design that we have here as trying to mirror as closely as possible the kind of dilemmas that I think are really at stake in democratic backsliding. Okay? You're faced with politicians, they propose things, some of them act undemocratically. And are you willing to, and I think it really goes to where I think elections are a tool of democratic self-defense, right? Like who is going to make up that coalition that when a politician acts undemocratically is ultimately going to say, no, enough, right? And so we have to model it. So here
you would not pay attention to the context.
Of course I would. No. So you're not aggregating across different countries. And so I think the generality of the results, in some sense, I think what I find striking is that, let's say, how important item here performs similarly well in places as different as Sweden and Serbia. So in other words, here the context is informative in the fact that it doesn't show up. Right? Like if it performs really well across all of these countries, and if the House satisfied item performs so poorly in so many places, it seems that that House item is somehow fundamentally flawed as a question about support for democracy. But I'm all for context. I'm all for context. And by the way, the Latin American countries that were listed as among the country sample were designed to comment on, to relate to your earlier remark, precisely on this question of, so let me go rephrase this in the following. When we did this analysis in Europe, and we looked at parties, that is, instead of doing heterogeneity by personal attributes or survey for democracy question, let's do it by the party that you would support. There was a clear relationship, country by country, with the exception of Ukraine. If you are on the right, you tolerate authoritarian candidates more than if you are on the left. And again, the striking thing here is it's Spain, Poland, Sweden, right? Germany. If you're a green in Germany and a green in Sweden, you punish undemocratic candidates the most. If you're on the far right, less surprisingly, you punish them the least. But also if you're a Christian Democrat, you punish them less than a social democrat. And I find the fact that it occurs, with the exception of Ukraine, in every country, Estonia, Sweden, Germany, Poland, I think there's something interesting. And so we on purpose decided to do the similar research design in Latin America, where these differences between the right and the left and the legacies of what the right was associated in some countries, what the left was associated in some countries, are more pronounced. And so the perspective title is, commitment to democracy, left, right, and center, to basically precisely get at this question. Could it be that depending on, in this case, context, the legacies of authoritarianism, people on the right and the left actually are less likely or more likely to tolerate authoritarianism in some places rather than others?
Actually past where we usually go to, but I do want to take one more question from Kelly, and I know others had questions. I apologize, we just couldn't get to everyone.
Thanks. Thanks so much for sharing this research with us. So I was wondering whether it would be advantageous, and maybe you already have done this, to look at those different, like on average, 12 different examples of non-democratic action and see how they relate to likelihood of defecting or not defecting. It seemed to me that that could potentially help you get at the security dilemma, the big lie in the US context, and then context generally. Because what I kept thinking from early on in the talk was, is it possible people aren't defecting because they're thinking they're saving democracy? So, and that gets to big lie, context, security dilemma, but could there be some clues by looking at which of those non-democratic examples are they defecting from, which aren't they defecting from? And for a particular individual, what are the different constellation patterns?
So we do some of that. And as I think I mentioned earlier, that electoral fairness is punished more severely, for instance, than checks and balances and civil liberties. When we rank them in cross-country context, there's some variation on within country context. But usually electoral fairness is punished the most. It's harder to do it with an individual because, if you imagine like 10 scenarios per individual, we on purpose design it so that each individual gets exactly one of them. So we could do that kind of count. But I think that should roughly be replicated in an aggregate metric that says that on average electoral fairness, but it could be that, so I guess what you're saying is, could we do like some kind of distributional summary that says, hey, 2/3 of individuals actually punish this most in this society, and only this fraction punishes this. So for instance, there are some, in the European context, there was one checks and balances that was basically that the candidate proposed that parliamentary debate be abolished because all it does is opposition parties use it to somehow frustrate the progress. That one is the least punished item overall. And I think that's good news, right? Like in some sense, if parliamentary debate is what people are willing to, tolerate, well, okay. It's way better than if they were willing to tolerate, attacks on electoral integrity or judicial checks or journalists or something like that. The item that is punished the most other than an electoral, so it's actually an electoral integrity item, is and I think this is interesting, it's the one where it says the candidate encouraged his supporters to violently disrupt rallies of his political opponents. That one is systematically, the moment the word violence is mentioned, people really don't like it. And so it's interesting that I think it's about democracy, but also specifically about violence. Like people don't like violence in politics.
Well, thank you. This was superb.